I'm Elizabeth, a literary princess, and today I am talking about who my favorite authors are. So I actually got this idea from Shelley Swearingen. She did this type of video a few months back, maybe? I don't quite remember, but it really got me thinking, who are my favorite authors? Because my favorite authors are not necessarily the people who've written my favorite books, because for a lot of those, I've only read one book by that author, or the author only wrote one book. I'm talking about you, Emily Bronte. Or I've read multiple books by them and I really only liked one of them. That is the case with Charlotte Bronte. I've read all of her books. I really only liked Jane Eyre, although I do need to give Villette a reread. But this really got me thinking, I'm like, okay, who are my favorite authors? And I really liked the guidelines that Shelley put out, that for an author to have been her favorite, she had to have read, I believe, at least 3 books by them and rated them 4 or 5 stars. So I decided to go through and look at the authors that I have read 3 books or more by and rated the majority of those books 4 or 5 stars. I also am not counting authors who have only read one series by, because that's just sort of one entity. It's like basically having only read one book by them. And as it turns out, that actually cuts out a lot of my fantasy books and authors, which is very interesting. I'm also not including any nonfiction in here, mainly because I don't read a lot of nonfiction by the same authors. Like, I'm more interested in certain subject areas, and then, you know, lots of different authors are writing about them, and usually an author doesn't have multiple books about the same thing, although sometimes they do. But I don't have any nonfiction here. This is just fiction. And I'm going to organize it by genre. We're going to start with classics, then fantasy, and then contemporary. And we're actually going to end with my go-to answer for who is my favorite author. Although the first author I'm talking about also could very easily be a go-to answer for who is my favorite author. So that's kind of interesting. So we'll start and end with the 2 that I would say are definitely my favorites. And a few of these I'm gonna be like, are they really a favorite author? Even though I've given their books 4 and 5 stars and I've read more than 3, would I call this a favorite author? Because I think for some of them, no, I wouldn't. So this is gonna be kind of a rambly video, just sort of me musing on what actually makes a favorite author for me. So if that sounds fun, stick around and we will jump right into it. First up, we are looking at classics. And this author, my first author, is definitely one of my favorites, but I always forget about her when people ask, like, who are your favorite authors? It's like she's so in her own category that I just don't even think about her when that question comes up. But she's absolutely one of my favorite authors. This is Jane Austen. I have given all 6 of her main novels 5 stars, although I question whether that is really true for Mansfield Park, but I'll be rereading it in July and we'll see. But Pride and Prejudice is, of course, a masterpiece. I adore it. It was my first book by her, and it's just wonderful. Jane Austen does such good character work. These characters feel so incredibly real and also timeless. Even though she is writing this at the beginning of the 19th century, I can see people like this. Like, I can go out in my day-to-day life now in the year 2023 and find people exactly like this. My grandparents are Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. Like, it's kind of scary. They are exactly like that. It's weird. So the fact that Austen is able to just be writing in the 19th century but still be so relevant in the 21st century is a true mark of an absolute master author, an absolute genius, and I truly do adore her works. Another of my favorites by her is Northanger Abbey. So this was her last published book, but it's actually one of the first ones she wrote, so the humor is a lot sharper it's like, it's kind of mean, and I really like that. And it's just hilarious. It's great. And Northanger Abbey deserves more love. It's kind of one of her more underrated ones. But the fact that I can laugh about this, and laughed about this in high school. I read this when I was about 16, 17. And the fact that I was able to find humor in these very 19th century situations, but they were still so funny. And again, you can still find people like this in real life. Like, even though it's centuries later, it really hasn't changed that much. So, And then, of course, my favorite by her is Persuasion, which is her most mature work because it was her last written. It is also the most romantic, in my opinion. Captain Wentworth's Letter. I had it read at my wedding, okay? That's how much I love this book. And again, the characters just feel so real and relatable. You can feel Anne's pain through this book. It's just absolutely masterful. Jane Austen is a genius, and of course she is one of my favorite writers. So, the next and last classic author I want to talk about is actually a newer favorite who I recently discovered, and now I'm writing a dissertation partly on her. This is Margaret Oliphant. Oliphant is actually very similar to Jane Austen. She has the same kind of subtle satire and humor that Austen has, just moved into the Victorian era. Her books are not romances the way Jane Austen's are. Even when they do end in marriage, you're not convinced like this is a great love story. This is about women in society and how they can find power within their social position. Hester is about a young girl who has moved in on the charity of her aunt, Catherine Vernon, who is this single woman who is running her family's bank because all of the men are so useless that they made a muck of it. And Hester and Catherine are very similar, and as such, they butt heads a lot. So this is really great. Again, it's about women finding power in their social position that usually doesn't allow them much power. The same can be said for Miss Marjoribanks, which follows Lucilla Marjoribanks as she basically just tries to take over Carlingford society and run it to her liking, and she succeeds. It's great. It's hilarious. Oliphant uses this mock heroic that I love to paint Lucilla as this like conquering hero. And it's hilarious, but it's also showing how women can become involved in politics because she basically gets their MP elected for the town. It's great. It's great. And Phoebe Jr. is very similar, with our main character Phoebe navigating society to mold things to her liking. So I love Oliphant's writing. I love that she is showing women becoming involved in politics and financial situations and religious disputes in some cases. So I really find her like the heir of Jane Austen, kind of. She's got this really pointed yet subtle satire and humor, but she is removing the part where it has to be a love story to kind of show that women can write more than just the love story. So she is absolutely one of my favorite authors. I don't think I'd be writing a dissertation partly on her if she weren't, but I'm so glad I found her. Absolutely a favorite. Next, we are moving into fantasy, and I have 3 authors to talk about here. The first one is, again, a fairly newer one to me, but oh boy, did she, This is Jill Walton. So the first book I read by her was Or What You Will, which I had as an arc. I'd never really heard of Jill Walton before, but it sounded so good, and it was. It's this kind of metafiction where we have an author who has this muse in her head, and then we also have the fantasy world she's writing about, and the muse is kind of trying to bring her into the fantasy world so that they'll live forever. It's fascinating. And I was absolutely blown away by it. So of course I went out and bought the rest of her, or not the rest of her books, but 2 other books by her that I really thought I'd enjoy, and I did. So we've got Among Others, which is probably my favorite by her. It's a love letter to the fantasy genre. It's set at a boarding school. It follows a girl who can see fairies. It's the perfect Elizabeth book. Amazing writing, amazing character work. But what really blows me away about Jo Walton is how different each book I have read by her was. Like, I would not necessarily think that Among Others and Or What You Will were written by the same author. And then we have Tooth and Claw. Tooth and Claw is basically a sentimental 19th century novel, much in the vein of Jane Austen or William Thackeray, except the characters are all dragons. Yes, and it doesn't sound like it should work, but somehow it does. And it is just as funny as Jane Austen, and you get just as invested in the characters as you would in an Austen book. Jo Walton just truly stuns me. I can't wait to read more of her stuff. Definitely a favorite author of mine. And now we get into one of my older favorites. I have liked this author since high school. I would say she's mainly known for her fairy tale retellings, but she does write more than just that. This is Robin McKinley. So, of course, I like her because of the fairy tale retellings. As you may know, I adore fairy tale retellings. Rose Daughter, which I go back and forth on whether this is my favorite or the next one I'll talk about is my favorite. But Rose Daughter is a retelling of Beauty and the Beast. McKinley actually has 2 retellings of Beauty and the Beast. The other is called Beauty. She's just such a gorgeous writer, and I love what she does with the fairy tales. And the fact that she can write a retelling of the same fairy tale twice and do it in completely different ways and make it an entirely new and enjoyable story is just amazing. Another great retelling of hers is Deerskin. This book is heartbreaking. Okay, she generally writes for a young adult audience. I think this is more on the adult end of things because this is very dark and has some very upsetting stuff, but it is just such a gorgeous story and so beautifully written. And everything by McKinley is. She blows me away every time. I think I've only read 1 book by her that I didn't really like, and it was very much outside her usual genres. It was Sunshine, which is a kind of urban fantasy vampire story. Didn't like it as much, but her very traditional fantasies, her fairy tale retellings are just marvelous. Same for Chalice. I think this is also another one that is more for her adult audience, but I love this. It is gorgeous. And look at this cover. Oh, I love it. So she's truly one of my favorite authors, has been for a very long time, always will be. The only thing I want from her is to finish her Pegasus series. She wrote the first book and I loved it, and then the second book never happened. So please, Robin McKinley, finish the Pegasus series. This last author that I have to talk about for fantasy is one who I really like. I have given everything I've read by her 5 stars so far, but I'm not entirely sure if I'd say she's a favorite author yet. This is Juliet Marillier. This is Wildwood Dancing. Like Robin McKinley, she writes a lot of fairy tale retellings. That's not all she does, but the only things by her I've read so far are fairy tale retellings. This is a retelling of both the 12 Dancing Princesses and the Frog Prince. And I loved it. I've loved all of her books, but I'm like kind of hesitant to say, is she a favorite author of mine? I don't know. I feel like I need to read more from her, even though I've read 3 books by her. This is Heart's Blood, a Beauty and the Beast retelling. Again, an excellent book. I'm pretty sure I gave it 5 stars, but I'm like, is she a favorite? And then Daughter of the Forest, a retelling of The Six Swans, which is probably her most famous one. This is the first book in the 7 Water series. So I'm like, I don't know. So I've read 3 books by her. They've all been rated 4 or 5 stars. So what is holding me back on being like, yes, she's a favorite author? There must be something. And we're gonna get to this with the next author as well. And I don't think I'm gonna have any answers, but we'll try to get there. So I would say Marillier is definitely on her way to being a favorite author, but she's not quite there yet. I feel like I want to read more books by her. All right, so now we're moving into the contemporary authors, and I'm going to start with one who, like Marillier, I feel like I'm like, is she a favorite author or not? And this is Meg Wolitzer. I have read 5 of her books, I think. So this is The Interestings, which was not the first one I read by her. I actually read her debut novel, Sleepwalking, first, and that's the only one that I gave 3 stars. The rest of these have been 4 or 5. I really enjoyed The Interestings. It's about a group of friends as they go from teenagers to adulthood and just kind of the relationships between them. And I really enjoyed it. I listened to it on audiobook. It was fantastic. Also by her is The Female Persuasion, which follows a young woman in college and then after, and her kind of feminist mentor. And this was 4 stars. I liked it. I related to it quite a lot. And then I read The Wife on audiobook, and this was about the wife of a very famous author and just kind of her story. I don't want to say more than that because it would spoil it. So I really enjoyed all of these books. But again, I'm hesitant to say Wolitzer's a favorite author. I'm like, so what is it that's missing? There's just like a certain je ne sais quoi. There's something, but I can't put my finger on what it is about these authors that I'm like, yes, definitely a favorite. And these authors who I'm like, I really like them, but I don't know if they're a favorite. I don't know. Does anyone else have that feeling? Please tell me. So the next author I want to talk about is one that I would definitely say is a favorite. This is Sarah Waters. I have read all but one of her books. She is a historical fiction writer. She mainly writes about queer characters. All 3 of these ones that I have to talk about today are kind of gothic, which, and 2 of them are in the Victorian period. She mostly writes about the Victorian period, although she does have a few that are set in other eras. These are just so well written. The stories are gripping. She pulls you in, and it's just so good. Fingersmith has this twist that I did not see coming, and it was so fantastic. Like, I actually gasped out loud. It was just like, it was so good. I love the way she writes. I mean, the little quote on here says, one of the best storytellers alive today. And I would completely agree. She is a fantastic storyteller. She draws you in. She makes you really care. She keeps you on your toes, keeps you wondering, what's it gonna be? And then my favorite of hers is The Little Stranger. And interestingly, for being my favorite, it's not set in the Victorian period, nor does it deal with queer characters, which is kind of weird to me. But this is so good. It is a haunted house story, but it is not your traditional haunted house story. I don't want to say anymore because it is so good. Again, I love the way she writes. I love the way she gets into the characters' heads. I love her narrators, who a lot of times you're not sure if you can trust. And I enjoy that so much. One of my favorite authors. I really need to read The Night Watch. It's the last one I have by her that I haven't read, and I should get to it. But it's a World War II book, I think. And I'm like, but I know I'll love it because it's Sarah Waters. So just do it, Elizabeth. This next author, I have actually not technically read 3 books by. I have read 2.5. And that half of a book I have read over like 3 times. So this is Donna Tartt. The Secret History is one of my favorite books ever. I adore this book. I love Donna Tartt's writing. I love the way she fleshes out her characters. She tells a fascinating story. This is just so good. Also by her is The Goldfinch, which I do have a physical copy of, but I lent it to a friend. So here's an image. And again, just really great writing, really interesting storytelling, really just gets you into the character's head. Even just based on those two, I would generally be like, yes, she's a favorite author. But then we have The Little Friend, and I have tried to read this 3 times and not finished it. I got about halfway through all 3 times. And it wasn't that I didn't like it, because I was really enjoying it. It was just one of those things, I fell out of the mood for it in the middle of it, or I was reading something else, or I had it on audiobook and the loan was up, and then I wasn't in the mood for the audiobook when the loan came back in. So I'm gonna try to read this in August. I would really like to finish it because I know I'm going to love it. And then I can really truly say Donna Tartt is one of my favorite authors, because I will have read 3 of her books, which are the only 3 she has. We're due for a new one, Donna. She publishes one about every 10 years, so I don't know. Maybe soon. That would be nice. But once I'm done with this, I know I'll be able to definitely say she's one of my favorite authors. And I want to be able to do that, like, with absolute sureness. So I will be reading The Little Friend fully, finally, in August. I would love a buddy reader to keep me accountable for this. If anyone's like, hey, August sounds like a great time to read The Little Friend, hit me up in the comments, because I need somebody to hold me accountable for this. All right, and now we come to my last author to talk about, and this is the author that when people are like, well, who's your favorite author? I immediately say this author. And I have loved him since I was 12 years old. And I will keep on loving him probably for the rest of my life. This is Stephen King. Yes, I'm holding up a dust jacket. I lent out my copy of Pet Sematary to the same friend who has The Goldfinch, but I asked her to leave the dust jacket here, so here is a dust jacket. Stephen King holds such a special place in my heart. I first discovered him at 12 years old through the movie Stand By Me, which is based on the book The Body, which really it's a novella in the collection Different Seasons, and I'll show that to you in a minute. And from then on, I was hooked. I went into Carrie, Christine, The Shining, Salem's Lot, and just the rest is history. It turns out he's also my dad's favorite author, or one of them. So my dad had all these Stephen King books that he was able to give me. So Pet Sematary was actually his. I think Pet Sematary is my dad's second favorite Stephen King novel. His first one is The Stand, which I have not finished. What I really love about Stephen King is the way he builds his characters. And the way that, yes, a lot of his books are scary. Pet Sematary is a supernatural horror book, but really the scary thing about Stephen King's stories is not the supernatural elements. It's not even necessarily the horror elements. It's the characters, because that's who the real monsters are in these books. So it's really not the haunted hotel you have to worry about. It's the alcoholic father who can't control himself. It's not the girl with telekinetic powers who's the villain of the story. It's her crazy, abusive, fundamentalist mother and the absolute horrible teenagers that just bully people for being different. With Pet Sematary, it's not bringing the dead animals or what have you back to life that's a scary thing for me. It's that in this book we see someone who would do it multiple times, despite the fact that it just doesn't work. Doesn't work out well, and he just keeps doing it. This book is really about grief, and I think it handles it very well. But I think that the reason why Stephen King is frequently at his best, like in books like Misery, where there is no supernatural, is because what's really scary is his characters. So this is about a writer who gets in a car crash and is injured, and he's rescued by a woman who turns out to be his #1 fan. And things don't go well, because a lot of times people who are #1 fans can be a little bit unhinged. And she is unhinged. So this is about obsession. It's about addiction. He has said it's a metaphor for his drug addictions. So it's just so, you're on the edge of your seat. You really are terrified for this writer. And it's so good. And then of course, my favorite, different seasons, The Body specifically. I have read only 2 of the stories in here, actually, even though it contains The Shawshank Redemption, which is another of his, considered his masterpieces. But The Body is such a special story to me because I read it when I was 12, and that is the time to read The Body because it's at its most relatable. And I truly felt seen by Stephen King here. I was like, the main character, Gordy, I was like, oh my God, that's me. The kind of shy writer, but who has these really good friends, but doesn't feel quite like he fits in with the world, and he worries about what his dad thinks of him. I felt really seen by this character, and I continue to feel seen by this character because he is dealing with the loss of his older brother. So I have in the past year been grieving the loss of my older brother. I'm actually kind of afraid to reread this because I don't know what my emotional reaction is going to be to it. But Stephen King holds such a special place in my heart for the characters he can build, the frightening characters who are the real monsters of the world, the corrupt politicians, the abusive parents who hurt their children instead of protecting them, the bullies who just are merciless and cruel. But he also can show the beautiful parts of life, the friendships. And that's what comes out in this book, is the friendship between Chris and Gordy and how strong that is. I'm getting emotional. So I think that's why Stephen King is my favorite author and will always be my answer for that question, because he just creates these characters that are so real to me. And he gets, especially into childhood experience, he is just able to nail it. He understands it so perfectly. I love him. He's the favorite of favorites for me. Probably him, like I said, him and Jane Austen, the first author we talked about and the last, are my 2 top authors. So those are some of my favorite authors, or some of the ones who I'm like, this feels like they should be a favorite, but I don't know if they quite are. Or in the case of Donna Tartt, she will be a favorite as soon as I'm finished with The Little Friend. I don't know if I came to any definite answers with this video, but I hope it was kind of enjoyable to watch. I would love to know, who are your favorite authors? Do we share any? What did you think of the books that I have talked about in this video? It has been great chatting with you. I will see you soon. Bye.